Hello everybody, thank you so much for coming. I love the fact that there's so many positive buzzy chats happening, and I feel like earwigging and seeing what they're all chatting about, because there's really good vibes in the rooms. One of my favourite things to do in the world is bring good people together, so it's really nice to have you all here this evening. And obviously we had to change venue, so thanks for noticing that. It's helpful. Originally we had the Tara building, and then a couple of hundred people booked tickets, and it instantly was too big. But then I was told that for free events there's a 50% no-show, and then I got myself into an awful state and I didn't know where to have it, and I was wandering around town, and I got this lovely room, and it feels like we're in a little piece of history here in Wynns Hotel. This particular part of Dublin has seen all sorts of bullet holes in buildings and walls, and there's a real kind of visceral sense of history here. And so this is where we've landed up, for better or for worse, and the right people have ended up in the room. I did interview Chuck Collins before, about a year and a half ago, just before somebody was elected in the US, not necessarily by popular vote, but that's another matter. So some of you may have heard that interview. It was recorded at his kitchen table, and we covered his background, his life, and we will go back into some of that here for those of you that don't know his story. But there's much more to discuss, and the world is obviously rapidly changing, and there's no shortage of issues to talk about. And we do want to talk about the difficulties and the challenges, but we're also concerned about hope and action, and how we can win and overcome. And I suppose for me that's a little bit of a motivation, or the sentiment behind Love and Courage as a podcast. I think partly the terminology came out of an experience I had given a presentation in the Oireachtas many years ago. I think it was to the Alcohol and Drugs Task Force or Committee, I can't exactly remember. But I remember talking to senators and TDs and feeling that they were hearing me, but they weren't hearing me, if you know what I mean. And it was this sense that these people actually know what the problem is. They don't necessarily have the courage to get on with legislating. And I suppose that became a reflection for me, is like, do I have the courage? Do we all have the courage? Because sometimes we have enough information or facts or awareness. So awareness isn't always the issue. Sometimes courage, but then courage from what, from where, and what the motivation is. And I suppose if I was to aspire to a religion, it probably would be love, as vague and grand as that might seem. And the idea that regardless of whatever our belief systems, philosophies or ideologies might be, that if we have love in common, then we can find unity towards a united course of action, and we allow diversity to occur within that. So I try not to work myself into too much of a state in understanding all of that, and what I do is get really wiser people than me to talk about these things. And so I'm really delighted that Chuck's in Ireland. He's actually here with his wonderful wife Mary, who's sitting up here, and they're actually on holidays. So I did what I shouldn't have done and said, do you fancy, doing a talk while you're on holidays? And so the thing just came about very organically and a little bit rushed. And our technical and our sound setup we're on a little bit of a wing and a prayer here. We have Facebook Live. Hello to people that are looking in on the Facebook Live here. And there are people following in different countries. I just want to remind those that have just come in if you wouldn't mind putting your phones on silent as well. So forgive, that's the disclaimer. Please forgive any issues with sound or anything like that. If you need to make yourself comfortable, take a breather, go out, get some air, that's all fine. It's a hot evening here in Dublin. And part of the organic nature of the event was me looking through to see who had come along. I spotted one particular name by the name of Enda Riley, who happens to be one of my favourite musicians. And I also decided to chance my arm with that one and said, you wouldn't fancy doing an L song, would you? And he said, I would. So on that note, I'm going to invite Enda up to open us up with a song. So thanks, Enda.
Thanks a million, Rory. Delighted to be here. And it's got me to become a bit more courageous with the love and courage. So I'm going to have two songs, one at the beginning, one at the end. The one at the end is more the love. This one is more about courage, because I wrote this one a year ago with a friend of mine, Brad Sanzenbacher from California, who was over in Ireland. Brad is quite angry about the situation over there. So most of the anger in this comes from Brad. Fair play to him. So I'm delighted to get to play this eventually. So this is called One Story. Mary fights for supper every single day. She picks her children up from school in a rusty Chevrolet. The Chevy's got a sticker, it says bless the USA. The same country that just took Mary's healthcare away. Oh, I never understood and I'll never understand why we let such evil live. There's only one story and there's only one fight and only one life to give. Oh, I tried to shun violence, but there's things I can't forgive. There's only one story and there's only one fight and only one life to give. Whoa. Everywhere I go, the rich are getting picked. And somehow they still fool the poor with all their evil tricks. I swear to God, this world who made it sometimes makes me sick. Why some of us eat caviar and the rest of us lay bricks. Oh, I never understood and I'll never understand why we let such evil live. There's only one story and there's only one fight and only one life to give. Oh, I try to shun violence, but there's things I can't forgive. There's only one story and there's only one fight and only one life to give. Whoa. Well, I pray for my planet, my country and my soul. And God knows we can't return the precious things we stole. But we're running out of steam, wish we were running out of coal. And maybe one day we wake up in a world we can't control. Oh, I never understood and I'll never understand why we let such evil live. There's only one story and there's only one fight and only one life to give. Well, I try to shun violence, but there's things I can't forgive. There's only one story and there's only one fight and only one life to give. Oh, I try to shun violence, but there's things I can't forgive. There's only one story and there's only one fight and only one life to give. There's only one story and there's only one fight and I've just my voice to give.
Thanks so much, Andrew. That was beautiful. Getting us riled up. I think we have to do some hickory pokery with our audio stuff.
It's not a drill.
Kind of, you know. Well,
All right.
two men on stools. Are we recording? I just wanted to make sure we have no issues here. Yep, looks like we're all good. So, Chuck, here we are. Thanks so much. You're very welcome to Wynn's Hotel with some of our finest citizens, documented and undocumented and otherwise. One of the things I've done with several of our guests on the podcast is ask them to take a moment before we start recording. And one of the reasons I do that is for myself as much as them. And the reason being is that I can be so busy and wound up, particularly when you're running around getting organised or on trams or buses and emails and phones. And I really want the conversations to be a little bit deeper than some of the kind of surface stuff we have in a lot of our media. And certainly have no argument with intellectual-based exploration and dialogue, but I also want heart-based discussion as well. And so for me, it's like I just try and like take the moment to have a little pause, and hopefully then the guest enjoys that as well, and then we start. So are you up for that?
Sure.
Chuck, are you up for that too?
Yes.
Cool. So we'll take half an hour or so. This is going to be great for the live stream people.
They can do the same.
So it's really a question also of breathing and remembering to breathe. And quite often I know I forget to breathe. So it'll take just a few seconds. So a few of you starting to nod off there. So
A long day.
So Chuck, what I feel inspired to start talking about for this conversation is to ask you how you're feeling about this question of hope. And there's so much going on, there's so much legislation, there's so much news, there's so much drama, there's so much action, there's so many questions. And even before this interview in the room, we were talking about homelessness and any amount of issues, but you're obviously on a little bit of time off, and hopefully you've had a bit of time to tune in, and you've been walking in Wales, I believe. Maybe you could share a little bit about where you're at in yourself as you reflect or take a pause.
Well, first I want to thank you for organizing this, getting us all together. Thank people for coming out. Thank Edna for singing and the work he does with song and climate change. And congratulations to Ireland for being the first country to vote to divest from fossil fuels yesterday. Today, yeah. To me, I do try to pay attention to the forward-moving things like that. And I've been struggling in our own state in Massachusetts to try to get the Commonwealth to divest from fossil fuels. So the fact that Ireland as a nation's done that will influence our political system. So things like that make a difference. And I guess I can see all the scenarios where things go very badly, where things continue to sort of unravel as a society, as inequality grows and the ruts get deeper, wealth gets more concentrated at the top, and the barriers to getting out of poverty and insecurity get deeper. So I can see that dystopian. But I guess what I'm aware of is this huge undercurrent of awakening that's happening. And coming from the United States, Mary and I sort of are very plugged in to younger people's movements, social movements that are kind of emerging, new political alliances and formations. There's a kind of fluidity in this moment that could go very different directions. But I see mostly positive, and I could say more about that. But so I guess I apologize for Donald Trump, on behalf of the United States. No, but seriously, I feel like as a country, we are responsible for unleashing this force on the world, and we have and this is our last holiday before the November elections, let me tell you, because we have a lot of work to do to try to reverse this course. But every day there are signs pointing to a kind of a new awakening and rising that I find heartening, and particularly younger people. In the United States, people under 35 are taking on a whole new possibility right now.
Mm-hmm. For people that aren't familiar with your background, Chuck, it begins in Detroit, Michigan, and you grew up in what might be referred to as wealth and privilege. From what I recall in our original chat, one of the big things that influenced you at the time were the riots that were happening. Can you bring us back to that time and share with people what was in the air? Because there's also historical context to the US, right, where we're at now and where it's come from, and are they the same issues?
Well, so I'm 58, but when I was 7, so the summer of 1967, was the Detroit riots, what people call the riots or uprising in Detroit. Very influential on me because I was, as Rory said, I grew up in a advantaged family, living in a wealthy, affluent suburb of Detroit. But it was hard to not notice what was happening, just on the TV news and in the stories, and there were curfews at night, and several hundred people lost their lives. And it was and I remember asking my mother, why is this happening? Why is this happening? Kind of badgering her. And she said, it's because things are not fair in this city. And I understood that to mean the gap between rich and poor, white and black, city and suburb, and planted that seed for me as a young person. Detroit has gone through, it's gone through its own sort of revolution and struggle, and kind of hit, gone from 2 million population to 600,000, massive white flight, people moving out of the city of Detroit. But they're actually kind of rebuilding, not based on the global model of how can we give away the store to attract businesses to come, but how do we build a homegrown economy that serves the people who live here. So there's kind of an interesting part of the Detroit story. But the other thing I should say is, I grew up in a fourth generation wealthy family. My great-grandfather was the meatpacker Oscar Mayer, which in the United States would mean a lot because Oscar Mayer had very powerful branding and songs and jingles that every kid could remember. These earworm, I wish I was an Oscar Mayer wiener, everyone would be in love with me. That was like that. So, and there's a giant Wienermobile. People have seen the Wienermobile? So some of you know, this is a car that's probably 20 feet long. It's a giant hot dog that goes down the highway. There are actually like 10 of them. And they just drive around the United States and people see them and they go crazy. Anyways, that's my family.
Do you have a Wienermobile?
I don't. I have driven one though. And I have a Wiener whistle, which is a small version. That's actually part of what they do is they give out these whistles wherever they go. So unforgettable, right? So that was my family. When I was 21, it got sold off to the Big Fish multinational corporation that got bought up the line. But that made my family, that public sale of that company made my family very wealthy. And so, and yet I kind of had this other seed of like awareness about inequality. So when I was like in my early 20s, I had a job working with mobile home park tenants, I guess kind of like caravan parks where people own their home but they didn't own the land, and the parks would come up for sale, and I worked with the residents to buy them and own them as cooperatives. So in the 1980s, I had this really intimate front row seat as inequality started to grow in the United States as to how people were surviving. You know, working more jobs, working more hours, going into debt. So that was one dimension of understanding inequality, what was happening to people, say, in the bottom third of the income ladder. But the other part of that was coming from an affluent family, a wealthy family. I could see wealth multiplying, you know, at the top. People would say, yeah, we bought that house and we just sold it for 20x. You know, we bought it for X and we sold it for 25x. Or we're invested in a fund that's earning 30% return. So in my own friends and family, I could see wealth multiplying. And together, that picture got me very attuned to how inequality was playing out. And then really, that was 40 years ago. Now I could see how advantages were kind of piling up, accumulating at the top, and disadvantages and barriers were also compounding and accumulating. So that was how, when I learned that, okay, economic inequality in America is growing, that's what came to mind for me. It was like, yes, there's something wrong here, and I know that picture intimately.
I remember the first interview we did, we talked about that time as obviously being one of the main sort of transformative periods in your life as to what was to come next in terms of you, I suppose, with your own wealth and how things changed. But there was one thing we didn't actually capture in the interview, and I think it was the next day you told me we were on a subway. Is it the T it's called in Boston? Yeah, we were on the T, and I think it was like 7:30 in the morning, and you started to tell me the story about the tenants in the mobile home park organising to buy their own property. And if you don't mind me sharing with people, like there was a tear came to your eye as you told me the story, and then a tear came to my eye, and there we were on this T in rush hour, and I could really feel the impact of that and what followed then with the story taking a little twist and these tenants coming to visit you years later. Would you mind sharing that story?
Well, I think, the thing that was transformative for me was these residents, and there was one particular mobile home park I think I was telling you about, really were all in it for each other. There were 30 different households all fighting to buy this park together. And at one point I thought, you know, I could write a check anonymously to help them figure out how to buy this park because they were short. They didn't have enough money. And yet they kind of basically pulled it together themselves, and everybody put everything they had on the table. And they succeeded in buying that park. In fact, I remember the day of the closing, one of the leaders said to a local newspaper, he said, "We are like the Israelites wandering in the desert. We just bought the land from Pharaoh." And what I took away from that was, I want what these people have. I want to live in a community where people are all in for each other, where people are in solidarity with one another, where they are willing to risk their own well-being for the common group. And I had grown up in this wealthy community where people were charitable, but kind of with a kind of arm's length way, or generous, but I'd never experienced that reciprocity and solidarity and mutuality. And so that's what I was hungering for. That was not part of my socialization. And that was one of the motivators along the way to my own decision to give away the wealth I had when I was 26, so I gave it away. But all along the way, people were like, "You can't do that. Life is dangerous. Even my father said to me, you know, you're going to wish you had that money. Someday something bad might happen to you. You know, if you haven't thought this through. And I remember my dad even saying, you know, you know, you don't have any children now, but what if you have a child and that child has a special need? You're going to wish you had that money. Or what if your partner gets ill? You're going to wish you had that money. You don't want to foolishly give it away. And I said to my dad, well, then I would be in the same boat as 99% of the people I know, and I would have to get help. And he said, well, in the end, you will have to fall back on government. And in the United States, that's a lousy and tattered safety net. Those were the words I remember. I said, well, then I would have a personal stake in fighting to make it a better safety net. And my father wisely said, oy. So idealistic. You know, can you imagine? Now we have children in their mid-20s, and let me tell you, it all comes back to you. You know? But that was, you know, my dad said, okay, I understand your need to move past this wealth. And I should say, I actually thought the money was the key ingredient in the advantage package. I had no idea how much other advantage I had, other privileges that were just sort of hardwired into my life. Being white, being male, going to private schools, going to college without debt, all these things that were just other advantages that I live with that I can't give away. But a couple months went by and I went back to my job, and then something bad happened, which is this mobile home park. The house I was living in burned down. And no one was hurt, but I lost everything I had, and I was kind of temporarily homeless and kind of trying to figure out what to do next. And the day after the fire, a friend of mine and I are standing in the kind of charred out building, and up pull a couple of cars, and out of the cars come like about 10 of these mobile home park residents that we had helped, you know, earlier. And they had shovels and trash bags and casseroles of food and things like that. And I think I said to Rory that, I said, well, that's when I knew I had gotten what I wanted. I was part of a community now that was going to help me in the same way I want to help others, and that I was going to be, on a spiritual level, I was going to be okay. That it wasn't all about, you know, that it was the wealth of relationships. So that was a formative experience that, you know, I try to tap back into that as much as I can.
Mm-hmm. I'm getting this sort of alternative term around social insurance is coming to me. You know, we have our social insurance system, but that's, and in some ways that comes down to community, and the stronger the fabric of the community around you, the stronger the other safety net, whether it's government or not, is. And I am conscious that yourself and Mary are deeply invested in your own local community. Can you tell me a little bit about your lives and your work around that?
Yeah. Well, I should say, you want to have a good social insurance system. You want to have a society that has, you know, where people don't become destitute based on losing a job or an accident, or so we don't have that. You know, certainly in the United States, it's getting dismantled. But yeah, I would say part of our lives is we try to live in a community where, recognizing we're in a transition. You know, we're living in a period of extreme inequality, where we're living beyond our means ecologically, that we need to prepare for a transition to a new economy, a new future. We need to live within the limits of the earth, and change our consumption of energy and stop using so much damn plastic, and you know, so we're part of, like, at the local level, in addition to sort of the political work, there's also the work of how do you support local enterprises, relocalize the food system, some of the things that you all are probably ahead of us on here in Ireland, but you know, trying to build local cooperative enterprises where we're less dependent on large global corporations to meet our basic needs, trying to create community banks and credit institutions so we can de-link from the global banking system. So we're very much part of the, I would call it sort of the local new economy, the rooted economy work.
Is that part of the challenge whereby we have to navigate the global, the national and the local all at the same time? We can't just isolate ourselves into either or system. It's almost like we're surfing these three different waves at once.
Right. No, I think there is something about where, I think it's Joanna Macy who said there's three pieces of work. One is stopping the bad, resisting the forces of extractive capitalism, which are trying to hoover up the wealth of our communities. There's rebuilding new institutions, and then there's preparing ourselves spiritually and in terms of shifting consciousness to live in a new culture. And so those, on any given day, you do things in each of those spaces.
You just triggered something for me in a positive light in talking about Joanna Macy, because I was, myself and Susan were fortunate to meet her several years ago in Berkeley. And some of the most amazing people I've been fortunate to meet, you send them an email and they reply. And that's because they're really nice people, including Noam Chomsky and others. And it's always struck me a lot, and particularly when I've been a younger activist, the power of somebody giving their time to you at a time where you need guidance or mentorship or eldership. And obviously we all get too many emails and none of us have enough time, but to actually make time for somebody to chat with them really and share, which is, I suppose, influenced me to try and make time for people as best I can. But when I think of Joanna Macy, I think we're now, I think she's in her mid to late 80s, and she's still going hard, and so is Noam Chomsky, and so is the Dalai Lama, and so are all these other people in their late 80s, and I'm thinking, how do I do that in my late 80s? They're flying out around the world, kind of still going at it, and hopeful as well. Ralph Nader, I saw him in Berkeley as well. And that just gets me thinking about the sustenance required in the personal practice to sustain hope in your own sort of ecology, if you like, daily practice or well-being, things like that. Because the whole road of social change and activism, or whatever we want to call it, inevitably for me can lead to the road of burnout unless we put in place measures to address that. Do you have a sense of the long road for you in terms of the next 30 years and how to keep the show on the road, apart from having the wonderful partner in crime here?
I think it's being in community with people, having a sense of being with others so that when you're down, they can pull you up. I think it's building, new institutions of support. I see my friend Lena Davey here, who's part of a Catholic Religious Sisters Order, and actually in Boston, I have a lot of friends who are nuns, and I've sort of been in these conversations with them about what can those of us who are not in religious life learn from people who've lived in community their entire lives and supported one another, spirit, economically, how do we do that? And I think that's an interesting, so I've been having fun with those conversations. But yeah, I think part of it is, we have to, one of the things that happened after Donald Trump was elected was Mary said, there's this big women's march in Washington, D.C., but I don't really want to go to Washington, D.C., because we live in Boston. It's a lot, it takes a fair amount of resources to do that. Not everybody can do that. So she just decided she would organize the Boston Women's March, the sister march, for people who couldn't go to Washington, and got sent away for, talked to the city and got the permit. And she's thinking, we probably could get 5,000 people. And how many porta-johns, how many, what do you call it here?
Horses.
Portalets do we need, let's see, for the Women's March, 5,000 portalets, whatever. So, and then, every day more and more people kept saying they're coming, so 200,000 people came to this march on a winter day. And as you know, these marches happened all over the world. So then the question is, what do you do after that? What's next? And a lot of them formed these support groups. We're going to get together every Monday for coffee. We're going to talk about how are you doing, what are you called to do, what support do you need to take, the action that you need to take, and I think that kind of those cells and support is how we kind of, particularly in a time of acute crisis, how we sort of survive together. So that, and we just walked the Pembrokeshire coastal path, which is, it's good to walk. Get out and walk. Kind of keeps you. So it was hard. That's why I'm wearing my hiking boots. They're the only shoes I have here, but on holiday. But I think to try to find ways to walk as much as possible helps us.
Yeah. So I was wondering how long it would sort of take to come up, that we kind of have to get into the Trump factor. I'm conscious he's arriving in the UK today.
Right now.
Yeah, right now.
We were tempted to stay and be part of the welcoming committee, but we had the commitment to come back here. So.
Well, yeah, he's not brave enough to come here yet. Well, I don't know. There was talk of him coming here before, and there was already talk of organising around that. And he has a hotel in the west of Ireland. And the last time he arrived in Ireland, our Minister for Finance at the time, they rolled out a red carpet and had women in Irish dancing regalia, and it was very, yeah. Anyway, so just can you talk about what for you were the underlying dimensions to what brought about Donald Trump as we currently know him? Because again, coming back to the original interview we did, that was on the eve of the election almost, and we had Bernie Sanders, we had Hillary, and then we had Trump, and now we have Trump, and he's not going anywhere, and the talk is of a second term. But can you talk about the underlying dynamics that have brought about this?
Well, I think you all, you've probably soaked up enough about how did Trump come about, history, theory, or whatever, but the one thing I would say is just to understand, this gets to the inequality dynamics in the United States. So for 40 years, real wages for half the population have been stagnant or fallen. So half the population has not shared in the economic gains of the last 40 years, since Jimmy Carter was the president of the United States. So that's a huge, and that's, inequality has grown under Republican and Democratic administrations, and this is a global trend, but in the US, it just hasn't abated. So you have in rural areas, in inner cities, in former suburbs, you have millions of people who have been left behind, who feel a sense of betrayal that the political elites have not listened or cared about them, which is true. So then that has given rise to both a progressive populism, which is the Bernie Sanders movement, and and I've known Bernie and worked with Bernie for 35 years, but when he announced he was going to run for president, I don't know what the equivalent in art, but he's been saying the same thing for 35 years, but something caught fire in his straightforward manner, and the next thing you know, millions of people are coming out. Young people are excited about this, 70-year-old guy. There's a movement there. We can talk more about that. But so there is a progressive populism, and in the United States, populism is not a negative word, as it is in France and other places. Populism actually has this positive historic resonance, from the 1880s and 1890s, when the populist movement was a rural farmers movement pushing for, taxing the wealthy, breaking up the big combinations and trusts of corporations. There was a populist party. It had a progressive element to it. It had a focus on the power of the wealthy and the top. And at the same time, we have this regressive populism, which is the politics of anti-immigration, of deflection, of blaming elites, but mostly blaming new immigrants and others. And those forces kind of coexist in US culture. So 100 years ago, during the first Gilded Age, we had the rise of both progressive populism, but we also had the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and anti-immigration nativism, 100 years ago. Similar dynamics, coexisting. But the same underlying force was that sense like, half the population being completely left behind. Also, often rural areas kind of left behind. So, I think what happened in a US context is we had this rise of progressive populism, which is still there, and there's still a force there, and people are running for office as Bernie-crats, as people who model themselves after Bernie Sanders. But we have this tradition of regressive populism. And when Hillary Clinton became the candidate, she was perceived as the candidate of the status quo of the last 30, 40 years, pro-Wall Street, pro-neoliberal, pro-globalism. She obviously was better than Trump, but for many people, the perception was she was going to be the status quo. And what people wanted was disruption, and a vote for Trump was a vote for disruption. And that's what we got. And it would, really hinged on a few states that had been particularly left behind. And there's all kinds of reasons why that happened in this whole kind of confluence. And there would be, what's probably as puzzling to you as it is to us, is there's this 30 to 35% of the US population that continues to support Trump no matter what. And you kind of ask the question, what would it take for them to stop supporting him? I mean, but we're long past that point. It's that these are folks who are so angry or xenophobic or racist or just dispossessed that they want that level of disruption to continue. And that's what he represents. So that's a little bit of a slice of the context that I would add. So then the question is, well, is Trump actually addressing the underlying wound? Well, no. He's actually going to, the tax plan that was passed at the end of last year, which gives almost $2 trillion in tax cuts, mostly to global corporations and the richest 1%, will not improve the lives of that base of people who supported him. Nor will these trade wars. In fact, they're going to back up and actually hurt a lot of the states and regions that voted for him. What will it take for people to change their mind? I don't know. What does it take for you to change your mind? People get attached to a particular way of being and a perspective. So we want to, invite people to look at a different future. So, but I think that's a little bit of the context. What our view is we need to mobilize that 65% of the population that actually understands that Trumpism is a dead end, and turn, younger voters, people who've sat out the 2016 election, turn that into a political force, and both in the next couple months and in the next couple years. So that's our, that's kind of the dynamic. And I would say that the good news, by the way, is the progressive populist program raised the minimum wage, support for labor and workers, taxing the wealthy to getting them to pay their fair share, investing in low-cost higher education, maintaining and expanding a public health care system, Medicare for all. All those things are wildly popular, even among some of the people who voted for Trump, wildly popular. So the more and more people who step forward with that as their program, the more that progressive populist political formation will succeed and elect people. And but we're up against sort of some, the ways in which our political system is wired, the gerrymandering of districts, the influence, the erosion of democracy problem. But I think we can overcome some of those barriers.
So when you talk about the erosion of democracy, a lot of people are drawing parallels to the 1930s, rightly or wrongly, and the trajectory is such that, I mean, Fintan O'Toole had an article recently that has been shared all over the world in talking about experiments in fascism,
Right.
and it can be in one sense easy to dismiss that, but the whole sort of boiled frog analogy that step by step is the erosion so ingrained that these kind of things are happening before our eyes, and by the time that enough of a population wakes up to it, it's slightly too late. And if you look at the attack on the judiciary in the US, so it looks like we're at a moment of reckoning in some sense.
No, I agree. I think that there's a huge discussion going on around what's happening to democratic institutions. And
Sorry for those listening in the podcast here. I'm just readjusting Chuck's microphone. Classy move here. Carry on, sorry, Chuck.
well, yeah, it's absolutely a moment of reckoning. This fight over the next Supreme Court justice is going to be, you know, we may lose that fight, but I think people are gearing up in the next month to just all out resist this appointment because, but at all levels of the judiciary. So I think we're, you know, to the extent there's a segment of the U.S. population that's awake, and I think you need 20% fully awake to actually be a countervailing force to the current situation. That I think is very, very real and possible. There's a lot of focus on democracy reforms alone, which in a period of extreme inequality will not be sufficient. That's just the one thing I would just add. Like the concentration of wealth and power is at a level similar to a century ago during that first Gilded Age, which leads to a certain amount of corruption, disenfranchisement, but also creates an opportunity for a populist pushback, a progressive populist pushback.
Can you talk to us about the role of wealthy people in all of this? Because sometimes the narrative goes down the road of them and us, and you have a slightly different way of looking at that in terms of the welcoming, the embracing, the dialogue, and your work with patriotic millionaires and others.
Well, part of this is, I had this experience, which is in 2000, when George W. Bush was president, he made a move to abolish our death taxes, our death duties, what we call an inheritance tax or the estate tax. So there's a push to abolish a tax only paid by the very, very wealthy when they die and want to pass wealth on to their children. And at that point, it looked like it was a goner. I mean, it was going to get abolished. The votes existed in Congress. And we organized an effort, and I worked with Bill Gates' dad, Bill Gates Sr. and Warren Buffett, and tried to organize this group. And we ended up getting 1,500 multimillionaires and billionaires to publicly come out and oppose the abolishing of the estate tax, this inheritance tax. And we stopped it from being abolished. And at that point I realized, this is not a monolithic group. I mean, there's clearly a segment of the wealthy and powerful who use their wealth and power to get more wealth and power. But there was this other segment that actually was very concerned about democracy, equality. So that was what led me to help build this network called the Patriotic Millionaires. And I did a book about a year and a half. It came out right as Trump was elected, called Born on Third Base, which is, you have to appreciate baseball, I guess, to get the title. But the idea is you're sort of born, you start off well down the race track. And in that book, I tried to basically make the argument that these extreme inequalities of wealth and income are bad for everybody. I mean, there's all this evidence now showing it's bad for your health, it's bad for democracy, obviously, it's bad for social mobility, it's bad. And that it's not actually in the interests of people in the wealthiest 1% to keep going down this road toward a economic apartheid society. And so I sort of been out on the road for the last year and a half, talking to groups of very wealthy people, philanthropic networks and others. And what I found is that there's a hardcore, unreachable group who are living the life of luxury and are delinked from the rest of society and don't have a problem with that. But there's also this fairly large segment of people who see these trends and realize they're not in the interests, even their own self-interest, to allow this to go down that road. And they don't necessarily always know how to engage, how to participate in the social movements. And so my message has been to the people like me, my fellow 1%, is come home. Come home. Come back to place. Come back, put your roots in a place and put your stake in a place and work to make that as equitable as possible. Not an enclave, not a gated community, but a multiracial, economically diverse place. And bring the wealth home. And this is a big part of the message, is bring the wealth out of the sort of global financial casino, the offshore tax havens, the hidden bank accounts and trusts. Bring the wealth back to the real economy. Take it out of the fossil fuel sector, as Ireland's vote today, and put it in the new energy economy. So move the money. Bring the money home. And part of that coming home message is pay your fair share of taxes. Philanthropy, charity is important, but it is not a substitute for an adequately funded public sector and public institutions. That's where the fundamental investments are made that really make a difference on inequality. And in the United States, my experience is that the whole discussion about philanthropy is kind of a distraction. We're kind of over here talking about, isn't it great that the billionaires are setting up foundations and sharing their wealth? Well, it is great. Some of them are actually doing really innovative, good stuff, but that is not a substitute for a national health insurance system. It's not a substitute for public investments in infrastructure to have a healthy economy. It's not going to make the transition to a green economy. You're not going to do that with philanthropic money. That's going to be our tax dollars at work. So that's a big part of the discussion I have with people in the United States is charity is great. Some of it's good. Some of it's reinforces the status quo. We have to talk about taxes if we're going to really fundamentally address these deep inequalities. And that's not an easy discussion. Anyway, so that's kind of what it means to invite people home. And what I've realized is there are all these people waiting to be invited to something bigger and more meaningful than consumption. There are wealthy people waiting to be called to something bigger. And that to me is hopeful, because these folks can be allies to these social movements, funders, but also participants. So that's a piece of the work. If you don't have any millionaire friends, don't worry. There's still the work of organizing and defending our communities against the worst aspects of extractive capitalism, which are coming at us. But that's the hope.
So on the topic of coming home, one of the big issues in Ireland, particularly in Dublin, but Ireland as a whole, is the whole notion of home and shelter. Living amidst a phenomenal, exacerbating homelessness crisis that is not getting any better. And with that, a housing crisis where myself and my wife included wonder how can one ever own a home, and at the same time we have an investment system occurring that is being sort of aided by a taxation system, if you like, through global investment. So we have particularly cities like Dublin caught up in a global movement of capital that's in some ways dispossessing people from the right or the promise of a home. You've been writing a lot about this recently, how luxury real estate, for instance, is one of the growing phenomena.
Yeah, and I'm curious in our discussion to hear what you're seeing on this. So the part of this came about because where Mary and I live in Boston, we look down the road and there's this skyscraper going up. It's now, it's going to be 61 stories tall. Turns out it's a luxury residential tower. Average condominium is $6 million. The penthouse is $40 million. Who's buying this? Well, turns out this is like the 6th tower like this to be built in the last 5-6 years. So I knew that there was this global wealth class, very high net worth households, and that money is sort of moving around the planet, and a lot of it is hidden. Some $8 to $10 trillion of the wealth of the super rich is hidden in offshore corporations and offshore bank accounts. But it turns out a fair amount of that money is being invested in real estate. So that hidden wealth is actually showing up just down the street in these office buildings, or in these new residential luxury towers. Turns out very few people actually live in these towers. They're vacant. They are wealth storage units. They're just rich people saying, okay, I need to have my assets invested in lots of different places, and I'm going to have some of it in London, some in New York, some in Boston. That Dublin market's looking pretty good too. Maybe I'll park some of it over here. So it's a global thing, and I think a lot of our cities are just, we know we're facing, as Rory described, affordable housing crises, housing costs out of reach for most people. And part of that's just the local market forces. But this is now being supercharged in some global cities by this global wealth. And it's something that I think is interesting, because here's this hidden wealth touching down in our communities where it is in real property. It's not in paper wealth, it's not in digits, it's in real land and buildings. That creates an interesting opportunity, I would say, to tax it. So we've been in the United States working in about 6 cities to pass high-end real estate transfer taxes, tax luxury properties when they transfer at a fairly steep level, tax vacant luxury properties where no one is living in the buildings, and dedicate the money to social housing, funds to build permanently affordable social housing, cooperatives, public housing, whatever. And so I think here's a potential source of money for social housing that we should be looking at and engaging on. And in Boston, and San Francisco did this. San Francisco passed a very high-end real estate transfer tax, and it generated last year $44 million. So that's a good example of and if we could get cities around the world to kind of do the same thing all at the same time, then we're not going to be playing cities off against each other. And London is obviously the global center for hidden wealth and some of these luxury buildings. But I would predict that Dublin is going to be, is attractive for lots of reasons. So something to pay attention to.
Are there any specific campaigns that you've come across, whether it be in the US or in Ireland or in Europe, or as you look around, that are particularly have grabbed your attention, whether it be grassroots campaigns or larger social movements, for instance?
Well, I think one of the good things in the United States that you may not have heard about is that there are these state-level campaigns, and often it's linking. It involves taxing the top, but linking the revenue to something that really matters to people and comes with a kind of constituency. So in California, there's a movement to have a state-level inheritance tax and dedicate the money to free higher education, public higher education, which California used to have a much more kind of the best system in the United States for free public higher education. Wildly popular idea. 4,000 multimillionaires and billionaires pay an inheritance tax each year, 2.3 million students get free higher education. So those students are organizing, pushing, and that's the ingredient. Tax high-end real estate, fund affordable housing. Tax high incomes, fund early childhood education. So there's a bunch of campaigns that I think are trying to do that. And those are the ingredients. It can't just be, oh, we're just taxing the wealthy. To the extent, link it to something that comes with people who will fight for it and defend it.
I'd like to start kind of wrapping up to a point where we're going to open it up to the floor and get some conversation going with people here. And there are a couple of people who've emailed in some questions, but I'm tempted to hold off on those to see if those people are in the room. I know Joseph Cavan is here. Is Mary Boycel? I'm sorry if I've mispronounced your name. You're there, Mary. So I might just get you to ask those questions when we get to that point. Chuck, I just want to diverge slightly, and I know I've noticed recently that you're reading a book on trees. Is that right? You've talked to me a few times about trees, and I really want to know what's going on with trees, because it's like I'm going way off here into another realm, because the political, the economic, but then there's the climate change, but then there's the practical of the physicality of trees and ecology, and you do seem to have an interest there. And I don't know if the walking comes into that or not.
Well, trees are just like people. They just move incredibly slowly. They help each other out when they're weaker. They warn each other about certain threats. They communicate through the wood wide web, through mycelium and root systems. If there's a pest over here attacking Rory, he sends a message over to me, and I produce more tannins in my bark to defend myself from that beetle. I mean, what we're learning in the last 10 years about trees is fascinating and hopeful, and kind of is part of how do we regenerate the earth, And I often point out in the United States, Ireland has the rainfall of northwest United States, think of like Seattle and the temperate rainforests of the Northwest. If there was ever a place to rebuild a tree society, this could be one of those places. It'd be a lot easier to do it here than a lot of places on planet Earth. So I know that there's a forestry center up on the border in the north in Fermanagh that is twinned to a forestry center in the United States and trying to rebuild forestry culture and practices in Ireland. So I'm always intrigued. Whenever I go to like a place in Ireland where there's those ancient oak trees, with the moss and the fairies living in them and all that, I'm like, this is what Ireland used to look like. The whole island, it's kind of amazing. So and actually it is part of us, kind of a. Now there's like this. I don't know if you've seen these books. In Japan, there's a thing called forest bathing, which is like the new trendy thing, right? To go out. Basically, it's like walking in a forest. But I'm not talking about down a row of Sitka pines, but an ecological system of a forest, it has all the different life forms in it. So that's what people are finding is that their heart rate changes, their physical health. If you actually do this every couple times a week, your physical health increases. It's fascinating. So anyway, Mary and I are into trees. We have a little cabin in Vermont that Rory and Susan came. At one point last year, they were like, we need a cabin in the woods, Oh, well, we got one of those. You're all invited to come to Vermont. But it's a lush little forest area. And I think it is part of, back to that question of how do you sustain yourself, I think we're learning that we are nature. We're not apart from nature. We're not like visiting nature. We are nature. We are ecosystems inside us. We're part of ecosystems. The more we understand that we're animals and part of this nature, the more we begin to grapple with that. And I have a great novel for all of you called The Overstory. Think of The Overstory of Trees by Richard Powers. Just came out, it's taking the US by storm. And it's a book about trees. It's a novel about trees and people, which I highly recommend. So.
It's an interesting one because in Irish heritage, the tree was, I suppose, more revered, and we were more land-based or nature-based or ecologically aware people once upon a time. And it wasn't until recent years I realised how denuded we are of trees. I think maybe people know, I don't know, is it 1% forest cover? The least in Europe anyway. And what does that do to a people, to a land, to have lost its ecology in essence? But and you brought that further to my awareness as well. You've brought up Ireland a few times, and you've been here many times. I suppose I'm fishing for a compliment here, not for me, but for Ireland. Why not? You obviously like something about the place, and you obviously keep coming back for more. And it's not the trees. So, what is it? What are you seeing here that's getting your interest going? Because obviously the weather at the moment has been fantastic, but you don't come here for the weather. What has it been that's captured your attention about Ireland?
Well, I think the people here are amazing. The friends we've made, families that we've been connected to. I think you do, as a society organized, you do a lot of things right. In terms of community, people, institutions, there's a vibrant sense of commonwealth, social wealth, strong institutions. So I learned from being here. I do think your tree culture is there. It's like a recessed gene a little bit, waiting to emerge. But it's part of that, deep, I think, Celtic spirit as well. I predict great forests a century from now, there will be great forests in Ireland, returning.
I'm all for that.
No, but I think, but I love the hospitality of the people we've met. Got a couple of lads here in the room I've known since before they were born, when they were in utero. So that's an important.
Before
part.
they were famous as well.
Yeah, before they were movie stars.
Yeah.
Rock stars.
Hilo Walsh brothers down there, musicians and actors.
And that was the last time we were here. Was for the opening of
Sing Street.
So with my young godson over there.
Yeah.
It was the fake, he's got millions of fans in South Korea. Pinned up, his face is pinned up on all this teenage girl walls in South Korea.
Good. So just one final question, Chuck. The role of the individual, you've had people might call a hero's journey. You heard a call, you answered it, you're still answering it. And we all have our own different ways of doing this. Your journey is not ever going to be the same as somebody else here. Do you have any sort of universal thoughts around the power? Obviously, we've talked about the power of the collective, the power of society, but just the power of the individual to tune in. Because sometimes I know a lot of people struggle with actually fine-tuning that, how to be of optimum service, or how to really find the way for them to activate or to make a difference. And if you don't, that's fine.
I don't think I have a particular insight there, except try to find a cell or a small group that can be the people you can lean on to help you figure out what you're called to do and support you to do that. I think that helps a lot.
Yeah. So just even open up the conversations together and ask those questions of each other, rather than be on the solo voyage all the time.
Yeah. For a couple of years ago, we had, Mary and I were part of a group that met every couple of weeks, particularly looking at this issue of climate change. And we had a gas pipeline that was going to be built in our neighborhood. And it was going to be bringing fracked gas from the shale fields of Pennsylvania up to Boston. It was going to get shipped over to Europe, shipped here to Ireland as LNG. You know, Trump is at the NATO meeting berating Germany for negotiating with Gazprom or buying gas from Russia. Well, we're another pawn in that same geopolitical struggle over gas. Who's going to produce the gas? Who's going to sell it to Europe? Trump is representing our fossil fuel industry when he's doing that. So we're at the neighborhood level realizing we're about to get steamrolled. So we as a group, we just met and said, what are we called to do? How can we encourage each other to take bolder steps? And in that process, we organized an effort to try to stop that pipeline. We did not succeed, but 2 years, hundreds of people were arrested, blocking the construction of that pipeline. We kind of, people probably heard about Standing Rock, but this was our local Standing Rock. And all over the world, there's this global movement. Naomi Klein calls it blockadia, just people trying to interrupt the construction of these fossil fuel projects, which are not necessary. This was not necessary for our community, but it was necessary for the profits of the gas industry to build this infrastructure. So I think that was a really enlivening couple of years, and it informed, that same group continues to work together and as kind of an affinity group. So I think finding a group that can encourage each other to both love each other and be more courageous. Tap into the courage that we have there, what we're called to do.
Thanks, Chuck. Can we get a round of applause for Chuck? So, are we still live streaming? Yeah? Do we have anybody watching? A few. Hello, everybody. If people need a moment, you're free to take one. We'll get into a few questions now. I hate doing this, but I'm going to have to do the obligatory. Can you make a question, not a statement? Because we know the way these things go, and sometimes it's tempting to get into a big long one. But just in the interest of everybody getting a little bit of sharing the questions, just kind of keep it snappy if you can. I don't know, I think we could just shout them up. Sorry? Yeah. I'll get the housekeeping stuff out of the way as well, if you don't mind. I'm going to send around an email sign-up thing. I know there's GDPR and all of that crack. So there's 3 boxes that you can tick on it. One of them is for the Love and Courage or my updates if you want to find out about future stuff, the link to the podcast when it comes out. The other is to inequality.org, which is Chuck's website that he co-edits. And then the other is to Enda Riley, wonderful musician and songwriter who does some gigs all around Ireland. He's going to Irish and UK tour. So you can tick, and none of us will get offended if you don't tick us, where it will be grand. And the other thing is, I'd just say a huge thanks. I didn't know how to put on this event at the start, whether we should make it free or pay for it, and I did have a free venue, but then this one I needed a bigger one, so I had to pay for this, and somebody did donate, and I really appreciate that. And if anybody feels called, then there's absolutely no obligation to do so. We do have the traditional bucket, which my wonderful wife Susan is going to rattle or shake or spread around. It'll be at the back of the room at the end, but again, don't feel any pressure on the bucket front or the email front. Is there any other announcement stuffy things that I have to do? No, thank God. So Mary emailed in a question, so she was very proactive, and I'm going to go to you. And if you don't mind just shouting up, if that's okay.
I can't forget it with my question, but I know along with the idea.
I have it here if you want it.
It's on the lines of the possibility of having genuine democracy. It's something that we
Sorry, do
You
we?
could read out my question first better. It's on the lines of how possible is it to have genuine democracy?
Yeah, we got that. How possible is it to have genuine democracy?
Well, I guess the corollary is the more extreme inequality of income, wealth, and power, the harder it is to sustain democracy. So, the more we are disenfranchised by that inequality of wealth and power. So that's why I think we're facing the kind of democracy crisis we are. I think it is possible, probably in smaller governing units. In the state of Vermont where we have our little cabin, there's a 200-year tradition of town meeting, where literally everyone in the town gets together, usually twice a year, but there's this one day of the year called Town Meeting Day, where all the towns pass their budgets, decide whether to buy a new fire truck, etc. And there is a level of face-to-face democracy and people in relationship that I think works. I think it's harder on larger scales to have authentic democracy. So, but I think, we're you kind of alluded to this. I think we're at risk of losing some of the democratic, in the United States context, we see the erosion of democratic institutions and not enough concern about that, and you realize, okay, just like in Germany before World War II or, in the early 1930s, there's a portion of the population that's very happy to, vote security over democracy or vote, that has an authoritarian leaning, and that's troubling. And you need, in a healthy democracy, you need that countervailing force of enough people to push back.
Yeah, I think it's very easy to see the lack of democracy all around us, but I'm just mindful that in the last 24 hours, Ireland has made 2 global inroad headlines, if you like, in Francis Black's settlement goods bill around the occupied territories, and that literally is global significance. And today, again, with global significance, we are a small island, and both of those things had great representation in Francis Black and Thomas Pringle, but they came from people on the ground in communities and with NGOs obviously as well. I want to just invite Joseph to ask a question. Joseph Kavanagh, are you here? You're there, good one.
Yeah, just first about Joseph Kavanagh, I'm a social entrepreneur. I just want to ask, Chuck, do you think what we are seeing at present in the US in respect of the transfer of wealth to the 1% and the increasing governance by key corporate players is a part of a global strategy? And if so, is Ireland being sucked into this cabal-like power grab?
Yeah, great question. And I think that is the machinery of if you will, of extractive capitalism. There's what I would call regenerative economy, which is when at the beginning we were talking about sort of a transition to a new economy. I would call that a generative economy that doesn't take away nature and labor power. But that extractive economy is clearly looking to expand, the US-driven model of extractive capitalism. Yeah, I think that the real estate area is one of the areas. I think that the pitting jurisdictions against each other around secrecy and taxation is another area. It's definitely in the interest of the powerful corporations to, pay no taxes and pit one another off. And I should say the United States is a huge tax haven. In certain states like Delaware and Wyoming, global corporations from other countries are coming to the United States. So you all have heard, Google and Apple and all that from people in the United States, but the US does the same thing, pitting countries against each other in the race to the bottom around taxation. So I think that's another risk point. And as soon as Ireland tries to organize to say, you should pay your fair share, they'll be off to the next tax haven. So it coming together around global treaties around transparency, corporate tax reporting, disclosure of beneficial ownership of trusts and bank accounts. Those are all actually a little bit wonky, a little nerdy public policy proposals, but those are really important. And I think the United States is the laggard on transparency. And so that's why more and more money is coming to our global real estate market. We have massive amounts of Russian and Chinese capital fleeing those countries, but from all over the world. So I would look at transparency and real estate as two places where Ireland is at risk of being sucked into that US model of wealth extraction.
Sorry, I did a second one, but if you have time to come back to me.
I'll see how we go.
I liked your second question.
I'm going to try and push some sort of gender balance. Thank you, team.
Hi, my name is Tina Roach, and I really like some of your comments on the media in America. I just hear, that not just concentration of wealth, but for a healthy democracy, you definitely need a good, diverse media. And we hear this morning that Sky is going to be taken over again by either Fox or Comcast. But overall, in the States, which is some of the leading media, what's happening and how do you feel about it?
Well, I think we're seeing such a rapid transformation of media, the loss of sort of independent media. The one place, it's interesting where, this is actually a place where I was sort of talking about charitable funds or philanthropic resources, but actually that's where one of the places on a positive level philanthropy is making a difference. So ProPublica, some news reporting organizations funding investigative reporting, funding the kind of hard to sell advertising reporting is making a difference. So there is an undercurrent of independent, media that I think is still there, but unfortunately most people's media diet, are these larger sources. So it's part of that tier, and that division is now falling down media lines as well. One of the places where media is still flourishing is local media. Local weekly magazines, weekly newspapers are still able to be independent. It's the national outlets. It's kind of like our politics are captured. The larger venues are captured, but there's still pockets of independent conversation. So trying to hold on to those is the struggle.
Podcasts.
Podcasts. Yeah.
Yourself, Deborah? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Dr. Solomon. Similar to you, I kind of have like that huge kind of, I suppose, when you detect inequality in the world, it starts kind of like, we want to do something about it. But I think the thing for me is I am 24 years old, and I think once you tap into that, once you start seeing the inequality, you see it everywhere. And it's really kind of, it's like overpowering, kind of overwhelming sadness. And one thing for me is I have to stop trying to help everybody. So how do you do that? Like, you're obviously someone that really cares about making a difference. So first of all, how do you deal with the fact that you can't help everybody, and how do you pick who to focus on helping?
So Deborah, just for those that didn't hear, it was broadly around overwhelm and too many issues, and we can only do so much, and how do you fine tune that, and hopefully paraphrase that okay.
That was a beautiful question, and I would say what you described of seeing it everywhere is kind of how I feel too, and I think there's a certain amount of grief and loss that comes from just seeing the pulling apart and the woundedness and pain and I think part of it is how do you stay open-hearted, and feel that loss. And I have a friend who recently sent me an email. She said, I heard you talk 20 years ago, and you said that every day you read the news, listen to the news and cry for 5 minutes. And do you still do that? And I said, yeah. Part of it is like, there's usually in the privacy of my own car or room or something, but you know. And actually, I have to say, the thing that makes me feel the most is acts of kindness or acts of resistance when people do something for one another they don't have to do. Like, that is the ultimate contradiction. And so it's fine, you know, so each of us can be in that place where we can do, you know, and this is not that little bumper sticker or whatever it is, the daily acts of kindness or whatever. There is something to that. Daily acts of justice, of, you know, both realizing there's individuals who are being left behind, feeling that. Don't close your heart off to that. Feel that. Find a way to not harden your heart. And that's part of the spiritual practice, I think. And then, yeah, allow that to be part of what fuels your fire to commit to change, to stay in a life of working for change. You know? And I also think younger people under 30, the way these inequalities are cutting into your lives are much more deeper than older people who are maybe at a different economic stage of their life or have. And so, whereas, you know, and particularly in the United States, I see that the student, you know, young people who go to college, graduating with $50,000 of student debt, never being able to own a house. Their parents own the home, but that is completely out of reach. I'm talking about sort of the middle class who are seeing their economic circumstances change. And the more we kind of help, as you said at the beginning, the more we point out to people, this is about inequality. This is not just about poverty. This is about the concentration of wealth and power at the top. So there's a very robust focus on poverty, but we have to constantly make that link that poverty in an unequal society, there is enough. There is enough for everyone's needs, not everyone's greed, as Gandhi said. And just beat that drum each day in your conversations with people. So anyway, thank you for asking that.
And dancing, I hear, is good, yeah?
Dancing is good, yeah. Walking.
I heard a rumor that that's where yourself and Mary met.
Yeah.
Mary, you've been referenced several times here. Do you feel like coming and speaking for a while yourself? Because we're talking about Mary, no one can see Mary. It's like Holy Mary here. Do you want to come up and speak?
Oh,
you don't have to.
Other than,
Yes, you do know what to say.
She'll lead the dance.
Okay, see you, Chuck.
Well, I just want to reinforce what Chuck has said about creating community as being the way to create the fabric that we need in order to fight and resist the power at this point. And making connections with people in this room would be a great place to start. You're all here to hear and listen and learn and open up yourself to some of the things that we all, you know, we struggle with daily in terms of this inequality. So I would invite you to introduce yourself to someone else in this room that you've never met before and find out what you might share. I guess that's all I have to say, other than we're humans on this planet and we need to connect in deeper ways in order for us to move forward in a life that we all wish we could have. There you go.
I never trust anyone who says they don't know what to say. They're always the wisest. I'm going to take two very quick questions because the people had their hands up, yourself at the back, and then I'm going to go to you, and then I'm going to try and prioritize some women, if that's okay, just to yourself.
Kind of go on the back of your last answer. The recent U.S. defense budget, Trump asked for $50 billion extra. Congress gave him $85 billion extra, and Bernie campaign told we couldn't afford free public education, higher education in the United States. The bill for that was going to be $50 to $75 billion, which is the stroke of a pen, the money was made there for the military at the stroke of a pen. No questions asked. And how do we make this argument, or how can we make an argument that this is very possible? And a similar way here, Ireland didn't have a lot of money for infrastructure before the crash, or didn't think it did, and suddenly there was 40,000 euros put on every man, woman, and child in Ireland's head in debt for banks within a few short months for a bailout package. We're constantly told there's not enough money for these things. Quite obviously there is when the priorities are not for working people or for families. Can you speak to that, or how we can get that message out?
Well, I think there's your message. We're not broke. There is the money. The money is there. There is so much wealth in our societies. Huge amounts of it is hidden. It's pulled out when there's something like a military budget need, but that's where I think these campaigns, like in California, there is enough money here in California to have free public higher education. Let's demonstrate that in several states. And again, this is something that is wildly popular, the idea of reducing the military budget and investing it in human needs. That is a winning idea, except in certain congressional districts, in certain places where, they're making, big defense plans and that sort of thing, when it's essentially a jobs program. But I think that's a powerful banner. The fact that that statistic, by the way, that this vote just happened, is partly how we get the word out, that this trade-off. And a couple of years ago, actually, I was part of a film called We're Not Broke, which is actually about the international offshore tax system. Because all the levels of inequality that we've heard about are actually underestimate the level of real inequality, because there's so much wealth at the top, which is not being measured, counted, and is hidden. And so it's in all of our interest to kind of, repatriate this wealth that's hiding in the shadows. Some of it's in some of that real estate and land that's banked down the road by a shell corporation. That is the wealth of our society that's being kind of pulled away.
Thanks, Chuck. I'm just going to move to you, and then I'll go to yourself.
Thanks, Rick. Jimmy Darcy is my name. I'm just wondering, Chuck, what role do you think technology and social technology has in creating real community, creating real connection, and scaling up the examples that we can see of good, effective, small decision-making within place-based community? What role is technology maybe making all that?
Yeah, the role of technology, I think we clearly see how it's reinforcing some of the bad trends, but there's so much possibility there. There's some new kind of technologies that help with decision making, reducing the amount of time people spend in meetings. Meetings, face-to-face meetings are important, but a lot of times, I don't know about you, but they can be kind of deadening too. And maybe there's some ways, it's kind of like creating the Uber app for community process decision making, quick voting, quick polling. So there's a kind of new social technology science there that I think will help us kind of build this new economy. So it doesn't have to be just look like the old economy, like our grandparents' economy. It can be more. It can bring people together. It doesn't have the social isolation. It can help facilitate social connection. One thing I often say is privilege. Growing up in a privileged family, privilege is a disconnection drug. It disconnects people from each other. It means that if I have this wealth and privilege, I don't have to ask for help. I can sort of pay for things. And it keeps me from being part of authentic community. So I think that's another place where technology can help people find one another. I think having traveled in Ireland a lot, but also in the United States, rural communities, unfortunately, there's a certain history of isolation there, and but those could be vibrant, revitalized and become vibrant areas, back to sort of smaller scale land-based communities. And I see that experimentation happening, and I see the uses of those social technologies helping create vibrant, culturally rich, more musical, more connected, smaller communities. So you don't have to just come to Dublin to find your culture. You can find it in a lot of other places, and that may be one of the ways. Have you done a podcast on that?
No.
Not yet.
It's on the to-do list. Yourself, Tom.
Hi, I'm Norma. I'm a filmmaker and I'm a broadcaster for a community radio station. I wanted to ask you about the party political system, because it seems like in the US and certainly in Ireland, it's a little bit broken. Two parties and rearranging the deck ships on the Titanic constantly. And here we've had kind of single issue campaigns like marriage equality and Together for Yes, which for a lot of people that felt quite disillusioned with politics has brought them back into the process. What are your thoughts on the party political system, single issue groups, and where the two things can kind of meet, or the future for those? Should people be putting their energy into just single issues? What do you think?
I think in one of the inspirations I found is momentum in England around the Labour Party. So I think the idea of creating a movement-oriented, external, outside the party organization that sort of mobilizes, that does issue work, but also when it's necessary can mobilize as an electoral arm. So keeping the movement part of electoral politics slightly to the side, investing in that. And in the United States we have the Democratic Party, but we have the Bernie Sanders movement and Our Revolution, which is trying to be like momentum in the United States, helping run independent candidates, helping develop leaders, but also being engaged in issue areas. So I think, my friend Heather Gottney just wrote this book about the US system called Crashing the Party. And it was about sort of the fact that the parties are all going to go through realignment because of these inequalities and this sort of the populist moment that we're in. So each party is going to develop a sort of social movement. There's a right-wing social movement and there's a progressive left social movement. And that's that picks certain issues, student debt, healthcare, but also sort of has every time when it's necessary can channel that into an electoral arm. So I think I look at momentum and Our Revolution as the outside the party system, but proto-party, sister movement oriented.
I'm gonna go for, I can't see what color your shirt is. I was gonna say pink.
Hi, my name is Dot. I've got a question for you about so I think a big problem that we're facing right now is that capitalism has taught us to kind of aim for this economy of growth. So we want better, we want more, we want richer. Whereas I think what you're talking about is kind of community-based, local-based approach is kind of should concentrate more on like getting good life rather than better life, rather than concentrating on equal rather than more. So aiming for well-being of everyone rather than people getting richer or getting more of things. And how do we start reprogramming society to think it that way? So how do we rehone our thinking into kind of getting an approach of like, you don't need more, you don't need bigger house, better car, or 2 or 3 cars. You kind of can do with a bicycle and sharing a car with your neighbor,
Great question, Beth. Yeah, one good piece of news is when we engage in mutuality activities, cooperative mutuality activities, our brains light up like we're eating chocolate, you know, and part of our wiring is to be kind of the delight in connection and community. And that's what that a lot of the consumption is kind of a bad substitute for that. I start by saying, let's remember our nature, that's at the core. But the Mother Earth is going to essentially require us to do what you're saying. You know, we have to relocalize our lives, ratchet down our consumption. People familiar with the transition movement. It actually started at a conference in Kinsale, but grew mostly in the UK. Now it's a global movement. But the whole idea is transitioning to sort of the post-fossil fuel, relocalized economy, and creating new livelihoods, local production, producing more for local consumption, but also the cultural and joyous aspects of life, relocalizing those. And I think we have a lot to learn from that movement and things that, you know, previous generations have understood as well. We cannot, you know, we're consuming we're on track to consume 5 Earths, you know, in terms of our levels of consumption. So I would look at what we can learn from that transition movement about community practice and get connected to the things that really matter when possible. We basically can't, you know, one challenge, and this happens in the US, people say, well, let's just get the growth machinery going again, get the economy to grow, and then we'll carve up the pie more equitably, and that's how we'll reduce inequality. Unfortunately, that was the 1950s playbook, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. That's how we reduced inequality after World War II. Massive economic growth and focus on expanding middle class and expanding the trade union movement, et cetera. That, unfortunately, is not available to us now. So we're gonna have to create a new playbook for post-growth social vitality. Not a popular thing. No one's going to run for office on that anytime soon. We're going to have less growth. You're going to have to live with less. You'll be happier, I promise. Good luck. But we have to start living into that, I think, to make it possible for that to be a political program.
We're trying to share the wealth of the space as well, and I'm going to fail ultimately because loads of people are putting up their hands and it's not going to be possible to get to everyone. So I'm going to try and wrap things up in the next 10 or 15 minutes. But I do want to say we still have the room for another hour if we want it, or there's the bar downstairs. So Chuck has kindly said he's happy to hang around. If people want to have a chat and get to chat to others, that'd be wonderful. Susan's going to leave the donation bucket at the door shortly because I know some of you will have to go soon. And just to say that the podcast, I'm not sure when I'll get it out, hopefully in the next week or so. You subscribe on all the different apps and it'll be on YouTube and SoundCloud, and it's basically, if you just remember loveandcourage.org, you'll be able to find it that way. And did the sign-up sheet go around? Yeah, great. So I'm going to go to yourself for the question next.
Hi, Chuck. My name is Miriam. I was just wondering, do you feel that altruistic redistribution of wealth is as sustainable as, say, competitive redistribution? So along a similar vein of kind of the capitalist idea that how can people be expected to be kind of giving up this philanthropic sort of aid to other people when the majority of people are in these insecure sort of middle and lower class positions in society?
Good question. People hear that? I mean, I don't know if this speaks exactly to it, but I mean, altruistic being kind of voluntary. What do you mean?
More kind of selfless.
Selfless.
Willing to help other people.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think ideally we're appealing to people based on their sort of larger sense of self-interest. that it's not in anyone's interest to kind of have these grotesque inequalities of wealth and income and poverty, and that it's not actually in your interest to act. But at the same time, I think that in the end, you need to have probably rules limiting the hoarding, and I kind of work on both of those strategies, if you will, which is I'm trying to engage people who are in the 1% to say, bring your wealth home, pay your fair share of taxes, don't oppose tax fairness, become a voice for tax fairness, pay your fair share, don't hide your money. And there's actually people who are kind of coming around to that. It's a segment, but in the end, we need to have the rules of the society, the wiring, if you will. Was it I don't know if people are familiar with Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker movement in the United States, but Peter Marn used to say, we need to make the society easier for people to do good, to be good. And I think when you have the rules of the society organized to allow for the runaway extraction of so much wealth, it undermines that common good. So that's where I think the combination of the more we can appeal to people on their sense of deep personal self-interest, that's great, but that won't get us all the way there.
But do you feel maybe it might be better to try and incentivize that philanthropy sort of to get those people with the vast amount of wealth, to incentivize them to redistribute that wealth rather than just kind of asking to appeal their better nature?
Yeah, I don't know something about Ireland's charity laws, but in the United States, we highly incentivize charitable giving to the point where it's become a tax avoidance. And I don't think that's good. Because, going back, philanthropy is not a substitute for an adequately funded public sector and tax system. People are very confused about that. In the US, they think, I've done my part because I gave to charity. And we have a report coming out in 2 weeks about the creation of these donor-advised funds, which is an incentive system in the US to give your money to a fund that then over time you can give the money away. You take the tax break when you put the money in, but there's no incentive to move the money on. 2 years ago, the biggest recipient of charitable money in the United States was the Red Cross, providing emergency relief. This year, the biggest charitable recipient is the Fidelity Charitable Gift Fund, which is run by Fidelity Investments. It's a parking lot for money. It may move, but it may just sit there for generations. So I'm wary of too many incentives.
I'm going to offer a question to Enda. You wanted to ask a question mainly as a kickback for gives us a song, so I need to make sure you get your.
Just wondering about the likes of Bitcoin and blockchain and all this type of thing, that it's supposed to be, if it remains decentralized, does that make it a better type of money for equality, or is all money just follow the same laws?
Blockchain as a technology could be the foundation for community-based currencies and local real economy modes of exchange. Bitcoin, built on a blockchain platform, to me looks like another version of speculative finance that isn't adding, it's kind of like paper wealth creating wealth. It's delinked from real economies. So I would think as a technology, blockchain could be a way, if we all together said, let's form a healthy, generative economy and have a mode of exchange, and maybe it's tied to something we all value. We could use blockchain as a way to do that.
Just from blowing open the community perspectives, we've people tuning in here from Canada, from Connemara, from Donegal, and several other places, and it's amazing. I mean, obviously, the Zuckerberg empire has its many problems, but we can also use it to propose solutions and alternatives. So it's about getting creative and using what we can in terms of subverting or changing or replacing the existing technologies. Any final question? Oh God, you were very intense, so I'm going to have to give you one, and I'm going to get to you next as a very final. Sorry.
My name is Alex Biggs, and I just thought we'd hear, with regards to solutions, something about universal basic income. And what I mean by that is it's enough money that everybody gets once a month to provide them with a frugal but dignified lifestyle. And in Ireland, that would be something like €1,000 per month. In the United States, we buy $1,000 per month. And I would see it financed by a 5% wealth tax on that monthly savings. I'd be interested in your views of what you think about universal basic income as a solution to inequality, how you think it could be financed, and how much you think everybody should pay.
Well, I like your proposal. So I think universal basic income is a key ingredient in the solution package here. It doesn't get at the drivers or the machinery that creates these inequalities, but it can offset some of them. And if it's tied to a tax that you're describing, then it gets at the wiring more. It gets at the concentration of wealth at the top, funding something that is going to help everybody. So I think that's that putting those two together, you start to get at the wiring of the system. And in the United States, there's huge interest in universal basic income. It's like one of these undercurrent movements. There's a lot of Silicon Valley kind of entrepreneur, tech entrepreneurs who are really interested in it. My friend Chris Hughes, who started America Online, just wrote a book about it in the US context. And they understand how these technologies are going to create massive disruption to the labor markets, and how will people sustain themselves. And wealthy people have property income. Why shouldn't everyone else have a universal basic income? So there are some interesting pilots being funded in different parts of the country to test out the best way to design these universal basic incomes. And there's actually a guy running for president on the idea of a universal basic income. So it's kind of I think it's an idea that's totally bubbling up, and I think is a key piece of the puzzle. I mean, I think that I look to the Nordic model for the US as a healthy floor, of healthcare, basic income, universal access to job training, universal basic income, maybe in Finland's old model. That is the floor, and a progressive tax system that invests in public goods that people widely share. That would be, kind of where, and a universal basic income would be part of that. In the US, there's also a lot of conservatives who like the universal basic income, but it's because they want to dismantle every other aspect of the social welfare state and then just say, give everybody a little money. So there's some strange bedfellows, as I say, around that idea in the US context.
I'm going to take one more question. I'm going to have to wrap it up and get Enda to finish us with a song. But please do stay around and get chatting to each other if you can. And actually, before I go to yourself, just Enda, I want to say hello to Larry Masterson in rural Donegal. He's a social farmer. If anyone doesn't know about social farming, look it up. So Larry, you'll be glad that you're getting your plug in here through the interweb. Social farming is where communities come together and bring community to the farm, and particularly with people with mental health challenges, it can be really restorative practice. So he's one of the pioneers in Ireland, and I just saw him popping up there, which is exciting for me to see. So we'll go to yourself now, and then we'll wrap it up. Thank you.
Hi, I'm an American student organizer from Tennessee, which is deep Trump country. So I wrote down my question just so I wouldn't forget.
Good. Well, there's a lot of really good community practice going on in that space, you know, that would be relevant for Tennessee. Part of it is the you know, people have misconceptions about each other that keep one another from finding common ground. There are some real dividing lines, but and there are people who are just, you know, their brains are plugged into their Fox News rhetoric machine, and they're not going to be easily reachable. But there are a lot of people who are interested. For instance, these ideas that we're talking about: community, social farming, local economy. Those are transpartisan. Those are kind of not partisan ideas. There's a guy running for Congress actually in Southern Virginia, Anthony Fleckavanto, who I think has got the right idea. How do you talk about building healthy local economies? You know, getting at the underlying wounds that brought people to the point where they would vote for the kind of disruption that Donald Trump is dealing with. And it's creating inclusive economies where particularly rural areas that have been sort of left out are brought back in to healthy local economies. Nothing like starting a local craft brewery to get everybody together and working on the same, you know, working together. You know, so there's things that people are doing that are, as you say, reaching across the aisle, reaching across the partisan divide. Glad you're working. You're going to go back to Tennessee and help pull it together, right? Okay. All right, so there we go.
We get a double round of applause. I want to say a huge thanks to Chuck and to all of you for coming out tonight. We've gone a little bit over time, but I'd love to go for another hour, but I'm conscious that you all have possibly work or student or planning or revolutions to plan perhaps, and we probably will just make a call and say we'll go to the bar downstairs if people want to join for soft drinks or other types of drinks. And huge thanks again to Chuck. And Riley to sing us out. So thanks so much, Enda.
In the depth of silence sits eternity, waiting for a wondrous stirring melody, like a seed that needs no time to grow up to stars, and shining in the darkness is each living being, reflecting to the universe their amazing dreams. The cry of gulls, the howl of wolves in the night. So tell me you see me and sing me a song the way only you can sing. Bring forth the light in the darkest of nights the way only you can bring. And even though the darkness waits for everyone, and even though we struggle on without a plan, we'll light up that dark abyss, we'll fill it up with just one kiss. So tell me you see me and sing me a song the way only you can sing, and bring forth the light in the darkest of nights the way only you can bring.